I'm Dr. Howie Jacobson, and this is the Plant Yourself Podcast. Each week, I bring you a conversation with someone who's making a positive difference in the world. And for my day job, I help leaders and their teams master their mindsets so they can achieve great things. To find out more, check out the Mindset Mastery Memo, my Substack newsletter. You can find it at plantyourself.com/memo. And now, today's show. Hey, Dr. Howie Jacobson here from Plant Yourself. Today I'm trying something I've never tried before, which is to record the intro before the conversation. So in about an hour, I'm going to talk to Dr. Richard Hodge. And I find when I record it afterwards, I'm always like, what do I share? I don't, I want to kind of give you a sense of what's coming up, but I don't want to repeat things later that I've said now. So I just want to tell you why I'm excited about this conversation. So Dr. Richard Hodge is one of the leading systems thinkers about how organizations can work better and how each of us can matter more than we do now. So I'm just going to his homepage, drrichardhodge.com. He says, I'm driven by two beliefs. One, each of us matters more than we think. Two, we can do more than we think in the time we have on this earth. So already I'm inspired. And he talks about this. He says, I take my short life as a gift that comes with a custodial responsibility for the only living planet we know. I'm constantly curious. How do our decisions drive a sustainable good life, not just for human life, all life? All right, now I'm on board. So his 4-word mantra is no problem too big. And I have to say, this is not our first conversation. We recorded a conversation a couple of months ago. And afterwards, Richard wrote to me and said, I think that conversation needs to be number 4, that we have to lay the groundwork first. So again, as a systems thinker, he's thinking about presenting what we had talked about as something that might come out of the blue and not have enough of a fundamental framework for you to fully appreciate. So this may be an ongoing series. I'm excited for it to happen. And anyway, without further ado, Dr. Richard Hodge, welcome to the Plant Yourself Podcast.
Super to be here, Dr. Howie Jacobson, and otherwise I'm known as Richard, and I guess you're Howie, eh?
I am Howie, yes.
Splendid.
Yes, it takes all my willpower not to introduce myself as not a real doctor. I don't want anyone coming up to me with needing an emergency C-section or tracheotomy. So.
Oh no, that's very true. Likewise, but then in some circles, you've done a lot of work to earn that recognition, and it's right and proper that it sits in front of your name.
Yeah, well, I think we're gonna come back to that if I understand kind of the flow of our intentions, but and I have to say that this is actually our second conversation, and after our first one, you wrote me an email saying I think that might be conversation number 4, and we need to set the stage. So since you are one of the world's premier systems thinkers, I tend to defer and agree and look for the wisdom in what you're saying. So let's set the stage for this incredibly important work that you're going to share with us about. That basically, I just want to say, like, what first attracted me to your work was 4 words on your website, which is no problem too big.
Yeah.
Which just, like, my nervous system just lit up at the audacity and the positivity of that phrase.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think, having grown up, I was born in 1955, just as the world was awakening to space and all of those sorts of things. And by the time I was 14, like a lot of others who were 14 and other aged in 1969, sat there in awe as we watched, man step on the moon for the first time ever. and that huge accomplishment, was never imagined possible by my father or his father, and they were in the room with me watching this happen. But when you peel back the layers of that project, they started that with something and not really knowing all that they needed to know to make that possible, but yet they got on with it, right? So I think there was the very first thing about no problem too big is just being able to confront what you know, what you don't know, and what you think, so that you can keep those three things in separation and handle those different qualities of information in the appropriate categories, because things will shift as you learn more. And that's how come that Apollo program set up this whole notion of moonshots, and that any problem, and there's many big problems in this world, heavens, can be looked at as a moonshot. No problem's too big for you to take action and leave the world better for what you've done.
Yeah. So I kind of wanted to set it up with that, because that's not the way most people I know think about the world. They are looking and seeing problems that are too big everywhere. And the best they can do is focus on one little section of one little problem and feel like under-resourced to solve the rest. Or a lot of people are just like, you know what? I'm just going to live my life, let the world take care of itself, and they kind of check out in terms of pro-social impulses. And so, let's talk like meeting people where they are. Like, what do you notice or see in the world about how people feel about the world today?
Oh gosh, well, excuse me just a sec. One of the things that I notice. What have we seen? Assassination attempt in America, desecration still going on in Gaza, in the Congo, and other places around the world. Politicians saying one thing, doing another, and I don't have to pull out any particular country. It just constantly is part and parcel, and then a partisan media that fails to actually hold people to account. So it's, a lot of people, no matter their education, can therefore fall into any of those categories that you've just listed, and no matter the intelligence or the realm of thinking and capacity that some people may have, it's also very easy to be disillusioned with the world. And I take heart from something that I saw on LinkedIn, and it just reminded me from Bertrand Russell stating that actually disillusionment is the beginning of wisdom, because it's either, if you're satisfied with the world and you're not concerned about it, then great, live your life, enjoy it, right? If there is a measure of disillusionment, then look at that as being the opportunity for us to do something different, because clearly what's got us where we are ain't going to get us out of them. It's created the problem. We need to think and act differently to moving forward on that. And for me, part of the issue has been our education systems, which have been largely built on reductionist philosophies, which has broken things down, and from the Industrial Revolution, just broken the curriculum down and got us ready for getting into industry, into jobs that have been specified, etc. And of course, we know all of that is changing, that education systems can't predict exactly what sort of jobs are going to be there, nor what skills that really are going to be properly required. So part of the reframing that each of us that may feel disillusioned needs is to challenge our own ways of thinking at present. And where I like to start on that is for each of us to anchor on our own sense of value. And because it's when we anchor on value, how we've conceived it and how it's going to drive behavior, how we see the world and how we want to contribute value in the world, and then how value is counted. And when you look at that from a enterprise perspective, then you can say a lot about, what is good behavior. You can say a lot about what you're going to contribute to the planet, to people, for prosperity. But if at the end of the day your executives are only counting dollars, then all of the rest is mere words, and then that fall away. So I think for each of us, we can call hypocrisy on that when we see it, but I think it bears us looking in the mirror as to, well, what's our own value set? And what is the difference we want to see and be in the world? And then how is it that I need to shift my own ways of thinking about the world to be appropriate and relevant to the world? So then that brings up that issue of relevance and
so yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in and ask about, like an exploration of values? So if you talk to me in the morning, at noon, and at night, you'll talk to three completely different people about values. That there are moments where I feel really expansive, like, I really want the world to heal. I want people to grow compassion for themselves and others. I want us to be curious and be intrigued and in awe of the world around us. There's other times where my value is like, everything's fucked. Let me just hang on, live a good life, take care of my family, get us out of the U.S. because I think it's a burning dumpster fire, and move to Europe, where we're in Spain, where it feels a little bit better, and living in a nice apartment, and trying not to look at the pockets of despair all around me. And there's other times where my values might be totally around, like, let me see through the illusion, and this is all just samsara, and everything is perfect, and I just want to be embraced by an Eastern philosophy of no suffering, no attachment whatsoever. Yep. And all of those are inside me, and they can get triggered by countless little things inside of me and outside.
Look, and I see no problem with that. And I think what you've just described perfectly is an example of the complexity of life, the complexity that none of us are perfect human beings, and there is no perfect solution. But when I think about, my conception of value and how it drives behavior, then I just think of 6 things, right? And those 6 are honesty. Let's start with the truth. Because if not that, then what? All else is lost. And then transparency, not just the truth, but the whole truth. Then mindfulness, being mindful of where we are in our life. And you talk about, whether or not you're mindful about your own self and what you can bring to the world, mindful of your role within society, within your family, then family within a community, and then what you're seeking to do in the world at a larger scale. And that mindfulness then triggers those different conceptions of how you sit comfortably or not with your place, and as you fulfill different roles in life. And it's just being mindful of that. So I mean mindfulness in that sense. So that's the first 3. Then the last 3 is that when you're mindful of the the complexity of the world, you realize that we can't do it all on our own. So how do we collaborate? And here we are having a conversation. There's a collaboration for starters, but it can also scale up to something like, building Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport, which was a massive mega project of collaboration. But and the last two are accountability, and not so much as to who, in the old sense of finding someone that you can point the finger at and blame, but actually find that you're holding up a mirror to yourself and saying, did I do what I said I'd do? And then, because of the complexity, at times we won't be able to. We're imperfect humans, and we'll have to go cap in hand and say, oops, that didn't quite work out as expected. And so that leads to the sixth one, which is respect. That if the person you carry that message to, if you don't respect them and they don't respect you, then very rapidly the accountability will form back to a blame culture. And then what happens is transparency will disappear, and honesty follows rapidly after that. So I look for those sorts of things as being wherever I am, whether I'm thinking about me sitting on a rock in a Buddhist tradition, or whether me interacting with my family, or in the community, or on grander things, then those six things, I look to how they drive behavior because of the interdependence amongst them. And I'm guessing within you that you have some conception of value that in the ways in which you behave and work, whether or not with yourself, with your family, and with the community and businesses that you work with. So that's the sort of conception of value that I think is something that comes down almost to like the, I think, before we started this, you were talking about hardware and software, but, the cognitive processes, what is it that's the core? And it's not so much seated in the DNA, but I can't help but draw something like a cognitive imprint that is applicable no matter the situation.
Yeah.
That's sort of value, I think, then you can hold strongly, no matter which of those domains that Howie finds himself throughout the day.
Yeah, and I guess what's coming to me is how these would be default values in a traditional human culture, say the kind that we lived in for hundreds of thousands of years, and fall apart at scale, or seem to have fallen apart at scale, at the complexity of nation states, at the complexity where it's not clear to, if my world is 119 other people, then I can see how being shitty to one person ends up really rebounding on me. Whereas the complexity of the systems mean that the feedback loops are either opaque or delayed, or may fizzle out before I ever get bit in the ass by karma.
Well, look, that's true. I think that there's stuff that's come as a result of the reductionist approach to the way in which, and that reductionism actually is, our institutions are largely built on it, from the education systems right through the way in which industry works and the like. But just in between our last conversation and this, I was fortunate enough to spend some time in the company of some wonderful people, systems engineers, at the premier systems engineering conference that moves around the world each year, and this year it was in Dublin. And they had Professor Catherine Cormican give one of the keynote addresses, and she talked about Industry 5.0, and that really is about people, and automation and really mass personalization on a great level. But what she pushed that really stuck with me was the notion of growth being how you stop doing stupid stuff. Right? And then I had a conversation with a Professor Patrick Godfrey, and Patrick, in days gone by, was a civil engineer. He's now an emeritus professor, and he is part of the mentoring team of the Leadership Institute for Systems Engineering. But it's systems engineering that had its birthplace, going back to where we started this conversation, through the Apollo program. That's really where it gained a level of maturity about making big things happen. And one of the things that came clear from that conference was that part of the stupid things that happen is that from our reductionist world, there's such a drive for profit that the legal teams and the finance teams get greater say in the way big things get done than they have a right to. Right? And you end up doing all sorts of stupid things, like having a mega project. And where I come from, Professor Patrick Godfrey, was that he had an involvement in the T5, Terminal 5 at Heathrow, when that was built at the beginning of this century, in that first 10 years. Well, in fact, it was built in about a 4 to 5 year period, but they'd been planning it for a long time. But you would expect normal clauses to have, incentives, penalties, and all of that. They cut all that out. That was the stupid stuff, because what they wanted were was companies to come in that were the best in their line of business and work together as one. And so they set them up as everyone worked for the T5 project. All roles were of their parent company were done away with. They assumed roles within the T5 project, and all of that stuff around incentives and the like was cut right out. They were paid for what it cost them to contribute, plus an agreed profit, but it removed thousands of disputes that would otherwise happen in these mega projects. So that's one example of how you get rid of some of the stupid stuff that's really become part and parcel of the way in which we do things in the world. So it just because we've always done that doesn't mean that we always should. And there was one example of a successful project.
Before we get there, I've got fireworks going off in my head, and I want to kind of but hold that thought about the project. But if I could, like when you said, like the definition of growth is how you stop doing stupid stuff, that was so exciting to hear, because my views on growth growing up was growth is good. I think it's still the way our reductionist systems see it.
Absolutely.
Right? Growth on a finite planet is obviously, eating it out from the inside. So I'm thinking about, Donella Meadows, The Limits of Growth.
Yeah.
And then like what the vision that came to me was kind of growth as part of this like Mandelbrot set, like this fractal thing where the growth can happen in increased elegance as opposed to increased size, diameter, that you can, right?
Absolutely.
That the Mandelbrot set is an infinite shape, but it doesn't expand.
Right. But so I will come back to the project, because what that enabled them to do in removing that, then everyone wasn't looking for doing, the least amount for the most money. They were actually focused on how can we not only bring best practice, but now make it better as we, manage the interfaces between construction and well, and one of the other things that was absolutely crucial to this was getting governance in early. It's not something that's done later in the procurement phase, but actually brought in very early, because it then, a governance model needs to act in the fractal way that you described it, so that everyone then has the capacity to remove the stupid stuff that we might ordinarily do, but we don't do in this particular case. Yeah. Because it really comes back to the project in that case having a very clear value proposition in the agreement. And there was a significant amount of, well, I listed 6 things around behaviour. They had essentially a code of behaviour that was a major part of the T5 agreement, right? And that really set the governance frame and anchored the project on the way in which they needed people to behave for it to be successful.
Right. And
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah, and it's such a different view of human nature, right? That, like, if I were to tell you, come on my podcast and I'll pay you by the word, right? I'm making an assumption about your default incentives. That's actually quite insulting.
Yeah.
Right? That if you're going to come work and I'm only going to pay you for, here are the penalties and here are the rewards.
Yeah.
It's a very reductionist view of human nature as well, as opposed to saying we all want to be part of something wonderful, and how can we remove barriers to that?
Yeah, and of course what that then does is enable people to move from what's been an agreed value proposition to each of them thinking about what's shifting in the world and what's relevant in all the complexity of what's shifting technologically, socially, etc., that will help deliver that value. So then brings the intersection of both value and relevance to life, and enables people not only to look at relevance in the sense of, do I realize it and become aware that it's relevant, but also how do we get across the knowing and doing gap from being aware of something new being relevant to actually being able to make it real, because then you've got to look at all of the interfaces and everything else, and that was what someone else said in the conference, and that was Paul Nielsen from Carnegie Mellon University, that interfaces are often seen, particularly in this reductionist world, as someone else's problem. Well, interfaces are also the greatest, they may give you the greatest scope for problems, but they're also where you get the greatest opportunity for benefit and change.
Okay, can you break that down for me? I don't think I followed what you mean by interfaces and problems and opportunities.
Well, in a reductionist world, how if I ask someone to describe their organisation, what would they do? Typically draw an organisation chart, right? And there would be a whole string of little boxes between finance and operations and so on and so forth, and there's space between those two. Well, who is actually managing that space? So what do organizations typically do? Well, then they run committees, and we know how successful they are, but no one actually owns the space. Another example of that could be, and we've all been through transport hubs, where bus networks and tram networks come with rail networks, and perhaps at a port or at an airport, etc. Now, you can define each of those, but when you look at it as a whole, it's a precinct. Well, who owns the laneways and the passageways between one transport operation and another? No one. Perhaps the council. But is it the council's problem to actually then provide for transport security and the risks that may occur through those? But equally, there is, so those are the interfaces that are ripe for problems emerging, like, well, dare I say, in a transport hub that we've seen too much of, being susceptible to terrorist activity or whatever, because there's a high passage of people going through these interfaces. But also there's huge opportunity to make the most of those as social places where people can convene and have meetings and so on and so forth. And how then do you realize that as being part of the social architecture of people gathering? And that's what humans do, they gather. That's just another way of looking at it.
So when I think about a transportation hub, and you put me in mind of like an airport terminal, that gets that interface basically gets built by capitalism, right? Like, which is why I can buy a $3 banana, at a newsstand. Why like everything there is now set up for commerce. Where the bars are open at 6 a.m. and yet there's still metal dividers between the seats. So at 2 in the morning, after I've missed my connection, I can't lie down.
That's right. But then there's other ways of how other societies have looked at that, and the Singaporeans at an airport have actually looked at the interface and gone, you know what, can be a place of high anxiety as people try to rush and meet connections and what have you, or a place of stress because, hey, now what on earth am I going to do with 12 hours while I wait for my connecting aircraft from Singapore to Adelaide? And you go, well, now they've got big green areas and spaces where you can go and buy a bed for the day, all sorts of things like that, which actually then looks at taking the anxiety out of the interface between one plane and another. So it's again an opportunity to get rid of the stupid stuff, and it's not that anxiety is stupid, but it's what we don't want in our life, right? And that there are ways of releasing things that aren't adding value.
Yeah. Okay, so if our listeners are bigwigs and they're in charge of T5 or the Singapore Airlines master plan, I can see how they have a lot of hope that, like, understanding your concepts will help them create a better world. What about the person who is like the cement layer at Heathrow, or someone who's middle management who works for a car rental company at an airport, who are like, most of us feel like we are stuck, we are embedded in stupid systems with very little power. So one of the things you said was like, you matter more than you think. All of us matter more than we think. How do those of us who aren't at the top bring your insights to life?
Well, and I don't think you need to be at the top, and I'm certainly not at the top, but then I don't think that notion of being at the top is really helpful. That's part of, it's it's an archetype from the reductionist world that is causing so much, that's at the root of the disillusion and that many feel within the world. And I remember, in fact I can even remember his name, the fellow that laid the concrete around our home right here. he and our driveway had a particular difficult bit, right, where it changed levels, and I didn't want a step. You know, it was one thing my wife and I wanted, was no steps through here. So how was he going to do it? And he said to me, you know, I was dreaming of this last night as to how I was going to actually fix this problem and make this the best possible solution for you. And I got talking to him about that, and he said, but I regularly do this. I love my work so much that I am trying to find the best solutions for the needs of those people. And for him, that is enough. And there, in that, he has found his own truth and his own beauty that was driving him to do his best possible work, albeit, as we might say, you know, he's just a concrete layer. I will get Adam Valenti back any time I need concrete laid, because he was one, and his team that worked with him, you know, all worked with that of making it, you know, as best possible for serving how we wanted to live. And that was that service idea in his mind that made his work worthwhile. And you know, I was open to suggestions about, you know, whether or not it was exposed aggregate or whatever else. And when I invited him to say, well, look, you work with this more than I, what would you suggest? And again, he came forward and we went with his suggestions, and simply because of his attachment to giving us something that would last and look good for as long as we provided the care and attention that his product required. And so I think it comes down into the individual to see that it's enough for each of us, whether or not, you know, we are, irrespective of our capacity, do we work to our own truth? Is there a measure of goodness in ourselves that we can bring to others? And is there some aesthetic or emotional beauty around the feelings that we generate as we go about our work? Because that has a ripple effect that we never... Now, this is 15 years ago, and I still remember the guy's name who laid our concrete.
Mm. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that the idea of the hierarchy, at some sense, is a persistent illusion of reductionism, and that
Yes.
this guy who did this amazing job for you is infusing a spirit into the world through you and through other people in his orbit that can't be measured, that can't be charted on an org chart.
No.
So
it's like
yeah.
orchards that grow together, you know, and the trees that grow together that actually help repair and heal one another through the mycorrhizal, you know, fungi and the like that are active in the soil. But it's that whole network that we just, and the complexity and the entanglement that we don't see. Yeah. And I think that that's what reductionism has done, is broken our sense of story and understanding of how indeed we matter more than we think.
Mm-hmm. So one of the groups
replaced it with a hierarchy that says no, they matter.
Yeah. So one of the groups that I work with a lot are people who are just below the senior levels of leadership. Yep. in organizations, and when we get down to the crux of whatever problem they're having, the emotional or the let's say the cognitive glitch that we discover is, I need the world to be different so that I can be happy. Right. Or so that I can be effective, so that I can enact my vision. And so, a concrete layer who works for himself, who has a team, in some senses has a lot more autonomy than people who are embedded in hierarchical organizations and institutions. So how does your value, relevance, consequence, how does all that play when you are trying to create something beautiful in your division with your team and you're embedded in a system that's working at cross purposes?
So I would invite those people to think beyond their current job, right? And one way of doing that is, if you're given an instruction, and at the below senior level, it could be write this policy, and you go, oh God, okay. If this policy is the answer, what's the problem, right? And that opens the conversation to really understanding what the senior manager's executive is trying to fix by way of this policy. And as you have that conversation, then go on to say, well, if that's the problem, why is it a problem? And that may raise the appreciation, well, it does, to the context level, which may be the remit of the C-suite or the board or both. And now that senior manager can have a conversation about, well, why is it a problem? Well, if that's the case, are we looking at, is that the best definition of the problem? And is writing this policy the best way forward? And because there may be other ways of doing that, and even just having that conversation then exposes that senior manager to the executive and to the C-suite that they're thinking at the enterprise level, that they have the benefit of the enterprise at heart before actually seeking to write a policy. And I'll say this, I remember when I was doing a whole of nation health study in New Zealand, myself and my mate Les Haynes, and we were invited to address the question, what's the capacity and capability of the New Zealand health system to respond to serious and unusual emergencies? So a really big question at the whole of nation level. And we started around Wellington, which is the capital of New Zealand, and neither of us, I might have doctor in front of my name, but I'm not a medical practitioner, so we had a clinical advisor, and he was the senior intensivist, so the head of intensive care at Wellington Hospital, and he gave me and Les a nudge, and he said, now, understand this, bad health policy is more dangerous to my patients than the flesh-eating bug. Wow. Now that stuck. That's because if you're really not aware, not only of the context of why you're trying to write this policy and the problem that you're trying to solve, but also its impact when it gets out onto the streets, as it were, then you could be setting rules and regulations in place, because it is a regulatory function, that actually then impairs the function of those things that you most rely on. And in his case, if there was like infectious disease or whatever else, the number of ventilators, the number of intensive care nurses that had been trained, etc., were all driven by mistakes, or potentially hampered by mistakes in policy setting when someone was looking at training from another angle and putting in a training policy that they hadn't really thought through. So I think that the invitation, and you don't have to be a senior manager to go through that, regime, right?
Yeah.
You can be a software engineer, someone straight out of university, and because I ran a business for a global engineering firm that had a software development unit, and one of my software engineers, he said, right, I've got this job. I said, okay. Um, what do you know about this job? He said, well, nothing. I've just got to cut code to do this. I said, whoa, stop. I says, I want you now to go and have a conversation with who gave you that job. And I knew who gave him the job, but I wanted him to have the conversation and say, okay, you've asked me to develop some software for this. If that's the problem, if that's the solution, what's the problem? If that's the problem, why is it a problem? And you immediately take that piece of software into its broader context of what is the machine trying to do, and then where does that machine fit in a social undertaking. And until you understand that, then you won't be able to write the best possible piece of software to do the job that you're expected to do. So go and have that conversation.
I'm smiling. Yeah, I'm smiling because what you're describing is exactly what coaching is, right? Where the client comes to me with their problem, and it's a problem because they're seeing it from a certain lens, and they're inside the bottle. They can't read the label. And so I just ask questions to broaden the context. And when I do that, like, you know, what's behind the problem? Where's there an opportunity here? All of a sudden, their creativity comes flooding in.
Yeah.
And so can you help me understand?
So that immediately takes their cognitive framework 2 levels up as well as 1 level down, because the 1 level down being the end user.
So help me understand what you mean by why is it a problem? Like, do you have, I'm not quite clear. Is it, you know, like what's the consequences of this problem, or what caused the problem in the first?
Really, what's the context? You know, and
do you have an example?
In the junior case of the software, it was to fit within a tracking algorithm for a training device, which was a simulator for a new brand of aircraft that hadn't yet landed on the ground. So the context was to pre-adapt the users of the actual hardware before the actual hardware arrived, so that for these new, and that was an airborne early warning and control aircraft. So the whole point of that was to realize that you were trying to develop or contribute to a social outcome of someone who is going to work in and on a brand new aircraft that's not able to even see the aircraft for 2 years, but yet you're going to give them training in that, and that's the problem. How do we get these people ready and to shorten the cycle between the aircraft landing and then it being able to be put into operations, and that needing a particular, you know, tracking device, tracking subsystem that it was the interface for the operator. So I'm not sure if that's some years back, but the context for the software developer really was, look, you know, you've got to really understand what is the training need that this piece is actually satisfying before you can write that piece to your best ability.
So in other words, there are certain things that you might look at in isolation and say, oh, that's a problem, and then discover that it's actually not a problem because it's not an obstacle to some goal. It's a thing that exists, right? Like let's say I'm shy, and I overcome my shyness when I'm in social gatherings through a series of strategic decisions and psyching myself up in the bathroom beforehand. And so I would then come to you and say, well, I'm shy, and you would say, well, why is it a problem? And I go, well, it's actually not.
Yes.
Right. Whereas something else might actually be, like maybe I don't prepare well enough for the social gathering, or I don't follow up afterwards, which we wouldn't even be able to define what's the problem until you ask me, why are you even going?
Right.
Right.
And that is part and parcel of it. Well, do you even need to attend this social gathering? What is the need that's driving you to see this social gathering as a requirement for you? In which case, are you, go back to the earlier stuff, is this some of the stupid stuff you can take out of your life? Now, and then you go, but it's not about, well, just take the pain bits away. No pain, no gain. But equally, be selective about the battle and the pain that you put yourself through, and the growth that you're going to gain through that, as to how that sits with your own value proposition for how you conceive value in your own behavior, how you contribute value socially, and how indeed then you'll count value through the growth that would occur from you going and stretching your shyness into actually an engagement that enables you, not necessarily to like it all the more, but to being more resilient to those things, knowing that you're only putting yourselves in that situation when you know it really matters.
So I'm not, burning fuel unnecessarily.
There we are. And then that becomes far more, tolerable.
Nice. So I'm feeling a hankering for a Venn diagram. I know we talked about the value, relevance, and consequences to a little bit, but I would love for you to elucidate that model for me, and then hopefully for our audience as well.
Let me bring this up and see if we can indeed. So if we're thinking, we've talked a bit about value. We've talked a bit about relevance, and the fourth the third piece here is consequences, because what we're looking at is being anchored on value, knowing what is relevant in what you think about and what you act, but being aware of the consequences of your actions so that you're actually contributing what you're seeking to achieve. Is this showing right, or do I need to?
Yep. Looks great to me.
It's showing fine. It's just on my screen. It's got it in reverse.
No, you.
So the whole aim around that consequences piece is that, for me, it really, and it's something I took from that senior intensivist in Wellington, New Zealand, was that what if everything we were doing seeks first to do no harm? Because, every medico pretty much signs up to that and behaves in that manner. And what if every single one of us also sought to do that? And I'm pleased to hear from the Systems Engineering Conference that in fact there is a group of people in the world currently writing an international standard on seeking first to do no harm, where big things are involved. But when we understand our value and its relevance, then that actually gives us and imparts the will that we need to get on and make the changes, whether or not it's the very personal thing of going into a room where you may feel shy and whatever, but dealing with that discomfort and working through it, all the way through to going, well, yes, this is a really big problem and there's a whole lot we don't know, but we really do need to get a move on with it and get started. And that drives the will. And when we think about then not only being aware of what's relevant, but enacting it with a view to seeking first to do no harm, then what we're seeking to improve is, as what Adam Smith might have called the wealth of nations. But I don't want to invoke Adam Smith necessarily, even though I just did. But when we're thinking about wealth, too often today our economic thoughts and economic paradigms have been driven to growth. And you talked about this earlier, Howie. But what about all of the commonwealth? You know, those interfaces, those lands, those uses of the environment, where we've been extractive, but actually just ended up destroying the environment that was used by other peoples, etc. So there's a positive and a negative side of that. And with wealth, we need to think very carefully about the currencies that we're currently using, and indeed also thinking, you know, about the question of interfaces that we talked about earlier. Because if we've got a very narrow view of our own wealth and only trying to optimize the outcome for ourselves, then very frequently we sub-optimize the outcome for the whole. And that's something then that we need to be very mindful of as we proceed around that. So seeking first to do no harm then brings us round to a question here of, and I shall write it here, of worthiness. And worthiness is a concept. Worthiness is that concept of actually meeting the value proposition that we set out to do in the first place. That we're thinking about whatever we're seeking to do and its impact on the whole of life, so that we can not only move from, you know, user-centered design, human-centered design, but actually to life-centered design. So that, and I'm not just talking about human life, but all life. And if in our value proposition we've talked about contributing to, you know, for people, planet, and prosperity, then our worthiness needs to be measured against all those three. So it really is a way of closing the loop, or in a business sense, enabling people to realize that what actions they take matter more than they think, and for them to garner an enterprise view. Because it's very easy for one person to actually destroy the goodwill and reputation of an enterprise, right?
Well, that's
the rogue banker.
Well, it's also that you have these, you know, these systems, and within within certain cultures, like the one that I grew up in, and I think the one you grew up in, there's vulnerabilities like the tragedy of the commons or the prisoner's dilemma,
Right.
right? Where you wouldn't necessarily have that in an indigenous population that has mastered interfaces with nature, with each other, with others. But our systems, once we get reductionist, it's like Jenga towers. It's very easy to pull out the wrong
Absolutely.
block and it all comes down.
That's a very good analogy.
So
That's a very good analogy.
so what do we do?
Well, then I think it's really how we, having anchored on value, how then do we explore relevance? And I think that there's another whole hour around that, because I could talk about how that falls into four groups of questions, and they're typically questions that help you better learn about the why, that give meaning to what we're doing. They're questions that enable you to explore the how, and how in the sense of how we're connected to the whole. And the indigenous view there is really quite illustrative of the differentiation between a Western view that I was brought up with and an indigenous view, which would see them talk about their connection not only to themselves and to their land, but through the land to the water, the air, their ancestors, their song lines, the stories, and the air they breathe, and how they think generationally about the change and the culture that they're all connected to. That's so wholesome. But there's a group of questions there around how is everything connected. The third group of questions are around the what. So really that then helps us to reflect on the nature of the change that we would want to impart, but ideally working with those who deeply understand the connection so that you co-create that and then implement it through if-style questions, that if we did X, would that shift to Y, and does that add to the value and the meaning that we were seeking in the first place? And so there's a whole process that enables us to go in a infinity loop, which is life, right? A life of infinite learning through those four groups of questions.
I think we have accomplished what we set out to accomplish in this introductory session. How do you feel?
I think we have, because I think being able then to get to a point where you go, yes, okay, yeah, we have anchored on value, and yeah, look, I get the cognitive reframe that relevance is as much about understanding the software in our own head and how that has to constantly change to fit with the changing world, bearing in mind whatever action we take will have, and or don't take, will have consequences that will impact on the value that we're seeking to achieve. So how do we actually constantly work through that? Just like in the Moonshot program, they always knew why, and even the old apocryphal janitor story with JFK, saying, well, when asked, the janitor says, well, I'm here to help put a man on the moon. Now, whether or not that story actually happened is beside the point. It's actually that people connect with the overall purpose that gives their job a meaning.
Cool. So let's put a pin in it for there. I think next time we're going to talk about the dragonfly, which we can
There
see.
they are there, the wings of the dragonfly, indeed.
So we'll leave that as a little cliffhanger for folks. There's plenty to digest and follow up here. For people who want to learn more about you and your work, where do they go?
Come to my website, Dr. Richard Hodge, drrichardhodge.com. And from there you can see some of the things that I've written, some of the things, the way in which I engage with people in the world, and also just simply also reach out if you would like to explore any aspect of this conversation with me.
Well, thank you for that kind invitation. It's a font of wisdom. You have some amazing videos in which you take us through models, and I'm hoping we'll continue to explore those in our conversations. It is so much fun to talk to you because of the way you can open my mind to possibility without contradicting anything I already believe or know. But you expand the frame, and then naturally my mind gets bigger and more energized. So I really appreciate that energy.
It's great, isn't it? Because it does it for me too, right? It's something that is shared in those conversations, and that must have been what it was like to work on that T5 project, right?
Yeah, you almost made me want to go to Heathrow, which is it's never anything I've ever thought before.
Well, to go to T5, you'd have to fly British Airways, so maybe think again.
Maybe a field trip from Ryanair.
There you go.
All right, Richard, thank you
All
so
right.
much. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Howie. Cheers now. Bye.
And that's a wrap. Find the show notes for today's episode at plantyourself.com/591. So what's been going on? I've been taking the week off after the tournament now 2 weekends ago in Lerma. This past weekend, I did not go to Ultimate. I just relaxed. I stayed in bed as much as possible. And the more I rested and slept and relaxed, the more my body wanted. So this morning was the first time I've been active in a while. Went down to the beach to do a workout with Jay, my trainer. We added a new thing. We added strengthening shoulders with bands, sort of lifting up to the front and then laterally. So I'm hoping this is going to help my mid and upper back in the same way that all those squats and walking lunges have really improved my knees. Getting hot here. It's been a cool June and July for this part of the world, but it's supposed to become a scorcher now for the next 5 or 6 weeks, so bracing for that. Workouts have been moving from 9:30 to 8:30 to 8 to this morning 7:30. Next week we're going for 6:30, and hopefully I can get it in before the heat becomes unbearable. Also, apparently they are dredging more sand onto the beach where I worked out last summer, but the beach has pretty much disappeared due to a storm in the fall. And now they're trying to rebuild it so they can pack more tourists, get the restaurant back up, porta potties, and restore things to the way they were when we first arrived. So that's about it. Have as always, a good week and be well, my friends.